Thank you very much. This is really happening, isn't it? As Jessica said, Max was originally going to give this talk, but had to pull out for family reasons. Him and I have worked really closely for about a year on a project, a CSS and JavaScript project called Style Components. And so he asked, and the organizers here asked if I might be able to fill in, which is daunting. I've only had about 24 hours to prepare, so I please ask your forgiveness for the general improvisational tone of my presentation today. But I wanted to do this because there was a lot of stuff that I knew that Max wanted to talk to you about. He wanted to share with you, wanted to see your reaction to and get your feedback on. And so I thought if I could come up here, I could potentially do that. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to do exactly what Max was going to do, but what I thought I could do and could try to get prepared in a day was to talk about my own perspective on the work that we've both done, my own journey into working in CSS and JavaScript, and hopefully along the way cover everything that Max wanted to tell you using his slides. So I thought I'd start by introducing myself. My name's Glenn. I'm from Australia. I'm from Melbourne, like Mark, who just spoke. If you were here at CSSconf EU last time around, 18 months ago, I was talking about a project that Mark and I worked on called CSS-modules. These days, I am much more involved in style components. In fact, that's my main focus. And I've become a really strong believer in CSS and JavaScript for a lot of the same reasons that Mark just explained. But I think it's a place of real innovation, and it's really exciting. And I wanted to try to convey some of the things that I thought were important when I've been working on it, and why I think you potentially may want to get involved as well. I was trying to figure out what the summary of Max's talk was going to be, and so I thought I'd start with the conclusion, which is that I think what we're all saying is that CSS and JavaScript is worth looking at if you haven't yet. It's worth your time, the investment, in developing your skills and forming your own opinions about whether it's right for you. It's potentially only recently become a real candidate for use in your own projects, but I think it is there now. Max and I kind of came to working on this project together last year. Max is very heavily integrated into the React community. I find myself much more like all I'm trying to do is get my CSS to work. And so between the two of us, it felt like we were maybe going to stumble upon an API that might work. But in order to tell you about why style components is the way that it is, I thought I'd start by the component end of it. Because I think the idea of building your UI in terms of components is, I think pretty much we all accept that it's a best practice, but I don't think it's self-evident that it would be the case. So I thought if we talk a little bit about what makes a good component, why component-driven development is actually useful, it will help understand why styled components is the way that it is. Oh yeah, so one of the things that you could say, you could cast at the feet of components is that it breaks the separation of concerns. You could consider CSS, HTML, and JavaScript to be 100% separate concerns. And for the browser's purposes, they absolutely are. They handle differently, they're cached differently, they have different performance profiles. Some of them block rendering, some of them don't. But as an author, as you're developing these UIs, I'm not convinced that technological lines are necessarily the concerns of which you should be separating on. For me, components are a better separation of concerns because they encapsulate a unit of functionality. If you're talking to your designers, if you're talking to your customers about what you've built, then you're talking in functional units or visual units, not in terms of this one has JavaScript, this one doesn't. One of the things I like about encapsulation, or at least like about talking about encapsulation as the primary purpose of components, is that it really emphasizes the importance of what you call your components, what you name them, and how you design them, and what their properties are. And that, to me, is the real benefit to working with this stuff. So let me show you what I mean. If you've got a button component here, the button component, button class name button, renders out a button with a type of submit and passes through the class name. Now, this is a React example, but obviously components are common throughout every UI framework at the moment. So if you're not using React, hopefully you can translate these examples. All of the examples today will be React. So this is a pretty simple component button. The only thing it's really doing is hiding the fact that there's a default type of submit. Pardon me. If you wanted to make that button more prominent, bigger or a different color or something, then you might add a second class to it, a primary class. This is sort of the BEM variation, or modifier, rather. That simply gets passed through. It doesn't change anything else about the button. It just adds another class. And this is a sort of workflow, I think, that a lot of us became quite comfortable with and doesn't scare us at all. If you look at another example where you have to change the type of the button, but you also have to attach a class name, you get this sort of weird duplication, where you've got, you're setting two variables to say the same thing because potentially not all disabled buttons are the same, and so button disabled has some specific CSS attached to it. Really, what you've got here is these three distinct states of our component, and yet there's information there that we've written that isn't relevant to us as we're using these buttons. The class names in particular are just implementation details. What's really important to us is that there are three types of buttons currently being used: the default, the primary, and the disabled. This is our API contract. Between the user and the implementation details are all hidden. And what's even better is that you can name the component and the properties whatever you want. You can build up a library of terms that make sense to you as your team. I think this is more semantic than working with HTML elements and class names because, well, for one, you reuse HTML elements to mean very different things. Two, there's also only a limited set of valid HTML elements. And three, your class names have to be valid CSS things living in a global soup, a global namespace. The goal is to build up Lego blocks, like individual, customized, usable, reusable pieces that encapsulate something: behavior, visual, information, typography, something. And I think starting from this basic point, when you start thinking about how you would design a library for CSS and JavaScript, is where we got to, is how we created styled components. So, as Mark has just said, why would you want to use JavaScript to pass your CSS to your components? Why is it beneficial? He already talked about not automatically being able to make your class names not collide, maybe inline critical styles, optimization, package management, all of those things. But for me, the one thing I wanted to emphasize is that JavaScript as a platform to be designing these things is actually a lot more powerful than anything we've been able to use before. You don't have a preprocessor like Sass that's totally incompatible to every other preprocessor like Less. You don't have post-CSS transforms that have to be run in a certain order because they're all assuming that they read in a file from disk, transform it, and then export it. And that fundamentally is not as powerful as an idea as code and data. Just ask anyone, or the last time that you've had to go through your Webpack config to realize that these files on disk have to be loaded in the exact right way, otherwise the application breaks. But this is kind of where I got to last year. This is where I kind of hit a wall, because I was convinced by all of those arguments it was definitely going to be better to have authored your CSS in JavaScript. But I didn't think it was better to write your CSS in JavaScript. There was nothing that was as easy, as fluid, as powerful as the CSS that I've been using. And so then those benefits aren't worth it. I mean, Ivana talked about this morning about the skill and the value of people who know CSS and how that's often undervalued. And in fact, if you design an API for those people that really limits them and ask them to totally change how they work, then you're doing them a disservice. So what I wanted to do was to design a library that opens up the power of the JavaScript platform while still feeling like CSS. And that's what That's what style components aims to be. And this is where Max and I might actually differ about how we would pitch it, what we would talk about, how we'd explain it, and why what we're so enthusiastic about. For me, I see style components as the CSS and JavaScript library for CSS people. I think it's making a version of CSS and JavaScript that's as good as possible for those people. All the benefits of componentization and the JavaScript ecosystem without losing that power, that familiarity, and that expressiveness. See, Max, on the other hand, he might take a different approach. He might think that the real power behind style components is the way that it lets you encapsulate and combine these building block components more easily than anything else. And that's actually why I'm really glad to be working on this with him and the rest of the wider community that contributes to the project. Because, in essence, the project is both. It is trying to do both. It is trying to be both the best thing for CSS people and the best thing for component-minded people. And it does that by encapsulating the relationship between a style and its component in something called a style component, right? Hence the name. And expressing your design intent in a way that leads you down a heavily component-driven path. So let's see how it works. Now, the first thing to notice is that it's a normal JavaScript library. It doesn't require a Webpack config. It doesn't load files from disk. It doesn't need a Babel transform, although there is at least 2 that will optimize it and do other things that you can look into. But it's just a JavaScript project. The first thing you do is you define a style component title as a styled h1. And that could be a styled div, styled image, styled anything. It could be a styled abstract component, React, Rattle, link, could be anything. But that's your kind of syntax. And then beneath that, you just write CSS. You write a little block of CSS, and it should feel as close to writing a CSS file as possible. The only thing, I mean, if you're writing this in CSS, it would be dot title instead of const title. The only thing that's new here is a styled h1. Other than that, this is a string. Now, you may not recognize the syntax here. This is an ES6 feature called a template literal, which is the backtick there. It means you can do a multi-line string that then just gets passed around as code. This isn't being like pre-compiled or something by Babel or anything. For a second component on the page, you have the same thing, a wrapper component, and that should feel as close as possible to just writing CSS. It's quickly, the same thing, a name and some rules. So when you come to use the component, what you've done is you've completely hidden that information. When you, in this render method, in this component definition, the only thing that's there is the names of the components you're using, their relationship to each other, the fact that the title is inside the wrapper, and the content. Right? To me, this is the separation concerns that I've been looking for. If I want to go and change the wrapper to be a section tag instead of a div or a main tag, if I want to change the title to be h2 or h3, for any other reason, I don't have to actually change it here. That's all an implementation detail of the style component. The component now simply assembles these building blocks. But importantly, and as Mark touched on, when it renders, it's just HTML and CSS. It's like nothing different. It's not trying to re-implement the web platform. It's not trying to presuppose anything about what it's running on. It's just generating H1s and classes. And that ability to write actual CSS, I think, is a really big benefit. But we go a little bit further because most of us who've worked with CSS for a long time don't just write CSS. We write something like Sass. And so if you look at a more complex component, we can see what I mean. If we have a color changer, which in this case is a styled section, we can use a direct descendant selector by nesting. And this is basically because I liked this from Sass a lot, and so I brought it across. Now, nesting is the sort of thing in Sass that sometimes bites you a little bit, and you can overuse it definitely. But here, if that H2 is a little bit more complex, it'd be so easy to just break it out into another component that it kind of doesn't have that same failure case. It doesn't actually go as bad. What's also really good is that media queries, that sort of thing, like again in Sass, you just put them inside a component declaration. When it compiles, they get inverted, and the media query is valid. But it means that you can work with these things as quickly and as easily as you work with a Sass file. And so that's kind of the CSS half of the library, which is trying to be as familiar as possible. And in fact, like familiarity, I think, is a huge design constraint, and it's something that's really difficult to do. Like, the implementation of style components is massively complicated by the fact that it does nesting. But for me, it's really worth it because it makes it easier to bring the same knowledge and skills across into this new place. So the other half of style components is the fact that this is JavaScript. These are components. These do work like React components. And so we have different ways of solving the same challenges that every UI system has. For style components, that's using props. So in our button example, if you're not familiar with React, then button is the component and primary is a prop. In this case, it's just a Boolean attribute. We can use it by defining our button to be a style button and then using some sort of magic in here. We have this interpolation inside the template string, which is the $ squiggly bracket. Right? This sort of syntax might look unfamiliar, but again, it is totally standard JavaScript. It's just new. It's just not commonly used. And what we've done here is we've inserted these two functions to say that depending on the primary prop, either have it white on pale violet red or pale violet red on white. Now, you can use these interpolations for anything. They don't have to be functions. Functions will get run on every new component, but if you want to just use variables, this is the same way that you do it. It's very simple. That mix-ins, media queries, you can abstract them all. And in fact, Polished came out of the desire to get a standard library for CSS, basically, that worked in this sort of way. So that when you call this, what you've done is you've created one button without a primary prop, one button with one. They generate different CSS, and they get different class names attached, and so then they appear differently. So the next more advanced kind of feature is the idea of theming. Right? Instead of having to only change the display of something by talking to it directly, we can actually set up an environment and then build these components that respond to it. We can customize components at a distance, is my note. And this is some code to do that. We have this component called a ThemeProvider, and then you set up a theme as an object, which it could be anything, it'll get passed down, but basically in this case we've just set up a key and value, primary and pale violet red. These are Max's slides, he loves pale violet red. I'm more of a papaya whip kind of guy, but yeah. So that then when you render it, if you wrap it in this ThemeProvider, then that data is available to all of your style components. And that can really change actually what you think a component is responsible for. When you go to use it, again, you use one of these function interpolations, but this time you actually read the primary value off the theme, off the props. And then when that button renders, it'll come out pale violet red. If you want to change that button in two different places, you now have another option. Rather than just making a variant of that button, you can simply wrap it in a new theme. Here we have two themes, one with pale violet red, one medium sea green. I do like that color, actually. And then when you wrap it in those two themes, they render differently. You can do this stuff really, really well with CSS variables as well, but the theming, it works through React's mechanism, so its browser support will go a lot further back, basically anything React supports. Okay, the key here is that these variables pass down through the whole tree. They don't have to be directly beneath them, which means you can have components adapt to their relationship between the theme and the component without having to directly make them talk to each other. They can be different files, different parts of the tree. The final feature that I want to talk about, style components, is about React Native. So Mark touched on this, which is the ability, or the kind of new ability, or nascent ability, for us web developers to target platforms that aren't the web. Something like React Native is designed to offer the same mental model as React for the web, and it even re-implements things like the CSS Flexbox spec in order to make it as familiar as possible, but open up these new environments to you. So with style components, we support that we wrote a different backend. We wrote a backend that targets React Native. Instead of injecting CSS in the head, it passes those styled objects to the React Native components. It means you can work with these things you can keep things as familiar as possible. You still name things in the same way. You still use the same syntax for CSS, although React Native doesn't support all of CSS, so there are some times where it is a little bit different. But the mental model is the same. When you come to render it, you're still just rendering components, and in fact, this component here has nothing React Native specific about it at all. So potentially you can share some components that do something, but between web and native, they pick a different wrapper and a different title, because the wrapper on React Native is a view and the wrapper on the web is a div, say. But again, when it runs, it's just the same code as any other React Native code. There's nothing different about using styled components once it's running. So I would love if you would go and give this a try. Then hit me or Max or any of the other contributors up on GitHub or on Twitter and let us know what you think. There's actually a bunch of new stuff that's about to go into the library, which is what I was supposed to be working on yesterday, while Max was preparing his talk, but it didn't quite work out like that. This is pretty much all I have. So I just wanted to end by repeating this assertion. I think this stuff is really ready. I mean, like, you may not be sold on styled components, but there's so many other interesting approaches out there. There's so many other different design ideas being tested because you have this more powerful platform. And I wanted to kind of at least give a little bit more a wider view, which is the point of all of this work is to make things better for everybody, to try to make things faster or more reliable or more maintainable for your team, and potentially to make it easier for new people to join the industry. Every time that we can make things a little bit better, it helps everybody. And so I'm going to steal Mark's phrase for the end, because I really liked this. This was one of the core reasons that I felt compelled to actually work on this stuff. Actually, Ivan in the first talk talked about this historical separation between CSS work and real development. And it made me think that I realized the only way to understand all of this CSS-in-JS work is to realize that there was never actually any of that difference. CSS-in-JS presupposes that CSS was an engineering task all along, and it's just trying to bring the most powerful tool to bear. CSS-in-JS isn't an opposition to CSS knowledge. It's simply about allowing you to design systems that enforce the kinds of practices you think are important. These are the ones that I think are important. So in conclusion, JavaScript's really powerful, and it makes working with CSS better. Thank you so much for listening to me talk, having me talk. It's a tremendous privilege to be up here speaking to you, even if it's under unfortunate circumstances. So I wanted to wish Max all the best. I'm sure he'll be here next year. If you've got any questions about style components, please come and talk to me. I might have a little lie down now, but I'll be around at the party tonight. Thank you very much.
Bring it in.